Hi, everyone. Welcome back for week 6 of the Tadaima Fine Art Friday Artist Talks. Now, last week I teased that today's artist was the first person I thought of when I had to come up with a list of artists to invite to be part of Tadaima. Here's the reason why. Every day I go into work, I pass by or walk upon Kristine Aono's relics from camp. I love how it allows Janum visitors to essentially walk over the dirt of the different camps and to see artifacts on the ground. This installation has been at Janum as part of the Common Ground exhibit since the pavilion opened in 1999. Since that time, thousands of people have walked on top of the glass panes that protect the artifacts and soil. These panes also serve as windows to the camps for those of us who are descendants of camp survivors or those without camp connections. We can see the dirt, we can see the artifacts, but we cannot physically be part of the camp experience of those who were incarcerated. Another thing that drew me to Kristine is that both she and I are two of a small but growing number of people who have been to all 10 sites. In 1990, the first year I visited all the camps, the only people I knew of who had already done this were Frank and Joanne Iritani. At the time, they had produced a pamphlet about their visits to the sites. In 1994, this was published as the book 10 Visits. It was revised in 1999. Our first artist, Setsuko Winchester, recently completed this pilgrimage also. If you didn't see the first week's Fine Art Friday, please go to the Tadaima Fine Art Gallery and check out her work, and also watch her interview. Kristine Aono is a sculptor and an installation artist who uses a wide variety of materials to explore themes of personal narrative and history. Her art tells stories of her family's Japanese-American experience and cultural, racial, and social issues that reflect both historical events and present-day circumstances. Input and interaction with communities is often an integral component of her artwork. Among Aono's solo shows include the National Museum for Women in the Arts and the International Sculpture Center in Washington, D.C., and the Japanese American National Museum. Her work has been exhibited in places such as the Mary and Lee Block Museum of Art, Northwestern University, the Long Beach Museum of Art, the Bronx Museum of Art, National Academy of Design, Japan Cultural Center, Embassy of Japan, and the Washington Project for the Arts. She has received the MacDowell Colony Fellowship and numerous grants, including one from the National Endowment for the Arts. She holds a BFA from Washington University in St. Louis and attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. She has served on numerous art panels, given workshops and presentations with community groups, and is a lead teaching artist for high school youth at Arts on the Block. Aono has been featured in articles, broadcasts, and interviews with reviews in Artforum International, Artspace Magazine, The Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, and Yomiuri Shimbun. She's included in books such as Exhibitions for Social Justice, Unsettled Visions, Contemporary Asian American Artists in the Social Imaginary, Community of Creativity, A Century of MacDowell Colony Artists, and Art and Diversity in the U.S. Kristine Aono's studio is in Maryland in the Washington, D.C. region. I'm honored to introduce to you Kristine Aono.
Thank you, John. I'm honored to be part of Tadaima, and I want to thank you for inviting me to participate. I'd like to start off by giving you a little background of who I am. I am a sansei, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with that term, it means my grandparents immigrated to this country from Japan. I was born and raised in the Chicago area. My mother, Lily Takagi, and her family were incarcerated at Jerome and then Rower in Arkansas. They had been living in Fresno, California. My father, Tom Aono, and his family were living in Portland, Oregon, and they were in prison at Minidoka in Idaho. They were all incarcerated for 3.5 years, the duration of the war. I am deeply honored that my installation, Relics from Camp, has found a home at the Japanese American National Museum, or as we like to refer to it, JANM. Relics from Camp was first exhibited at JANM in 1996 in the original Historic Museum building. The late and wonderful Karen Higa was the curator. Relics went on to be exhibited at the National Museum for Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., where it was curated by Angela Adams. Then it traveled to the Harold Washington Library in Chicago. At each venue, the artwork was unique and site-specific, reflecting a collaboration with the local Japanese American community. Relics from Camp actually began when a dear friend, Dwayne Jeffrey, introduced me to the site of what had been the Topaz Camp. Dwayne grew up in Delta, Utah, near Topaz, and his family farm included a barrack that they called the Topaz House. It would eventually become part of Jane Beckwith's efforts to create the Topaz Museum. Dwayne sent me a box of artifacts he had found, preserved in the dry desert air for over 50 years. These became part of Relics from Camp. The creation of Relics from Camp spanned several years and included visits to all the Japanese American concentration camps. At each site, I collected soil. Soil had been an element in my artwork before, but I did not initially know what an important part it would play in this particular piece. I also took photographs at each site. This one is of Manzanar. Later, I would juxtapose these present-day images with the black and white photographs taken during wartime by photographers such as Dorothea Lange, Ansel Adams, and Clem Albers that I had found while doing research at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Like this one of a classroom. My dad's family had saved the hand-carved nameplate that hung outside their barracks door, and we treasured Grandma Aono's doll she had made with scrap material while in camp. Other families must have saved similar mementos and relics from camp. These physical objects have the power to spark buried memories and conversations between generations. The heart and soul of Relics were the people who loaned their family artifacts and stories for each installation. At each venue, we hosted community collection days where families brought their treasures and shared their stories, which became part of a binder that was exhibited along with the artifacts. It is an honor to be able to create an artwork that could spotlight these individual stories while also raising awareness of a tragic time in U.S. history when innocent people were incarcerated based on bigotry, racism, and greed. The next artwork I would like to present is an installation that was part of a group show titled Relocations and Revisions, the Japanese American Internment Reconsidered at the Long Beach Museum of Art. It took place in 1992 to mark the 50th anniversary of President Franklin Roosevelt's signing of Executive Order 9066, which led to the unjust incarceration of Japanese Americans. The title of this artwork is Deru Kugi wa Utareru, which is a Japanese proverb that can be translated as the nail that sticks up the farthest takes the most pounding. It alludes to the Japanese emphasis on working as a group and not calling attention to oneself. Discovering this saying was pivotal in my understanding of how my parents and grandparents and over 120,000 others of Japanese descent, 2/3 of them American citizens, could seemingly enter the camps without protest. As a child of the civil rights era, this quiet approach seemed puzzling to me, but I grew to respect this persevering hope that their obedience could prove their loyalty. This phrase and its translation wrap around the room. Covering the surface of the walls is a collage of copied documents from the National Archives. They are testimony from the hearings of the Committee on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, the CWRIC. It was a time when many who had been long silent about the effects of the incarceration were finally opening up. This was a cathartic time for the JA community, and it eventually led to redress. Also collaged on the walls are copies of letters written by my maternal grandfather, describing his life before and after the war years. Stippled into the surface of the walls is a grid of 120,313 holes, one for each person imprisoned. At the time of the show's opening, a little more than half of the holes were filled with rusted nails, showing age and history. The nails formed the image of the American flag on the main wall, while the remaining nails were in burlap sacks on the floor. Visitors were encouraged to add nails to the wall in honor and memory of those who had been incarcerated. If all the nails were inserted, the walls would be completely covered. When this show opened on May 10th, 1992, it was less than 2 weeks after the infamous LA riots, which were sparked by the acquittals of the white police officers who had brutally beaten a Black man named Rodney King. We were installing the show during the riots. A few weeks after the show had opened, I received a call from Noriko Gamblin, the curator. She was concerned on how I would feel about the reaction to my artwork, but I couldn't have been happier. Visitors to the museum had used the nails to write things on the wall like "No justice, no peace," the rallying cry for the riots. They had also added thousands of nails to the walls, forming peace signs, hearts, and writing words like joy, sad, peace, and art. Across the central image of the flag were the words "never again" and "racism still exists." The artwork had transcended my original intent. It had new relevance. It now linked the past to the present, the incarceration of Japanese Americans to current race inequities. In 2017, I was part of a group show called "If You Remember, I'll Remember" at the Mary and Lee Block Museum of Art on the campus of Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. Janet Dees curated this exhibit. I took this opportunity to reimagine the nail piece as one large wall, over 50 feet long and almost 12 feet high. Again, visitors to the museum were asked to add nails to the wall to honor and remember those who had been incarcerated. And again, I hope to transform passive viewers into active participants. This is how the nail piece looked after 4 months. The words empathy, resist, and persist are among the many words and symbols visible. This artwork, titled "The Nail That Sticks Up the Farthest," was created in 2017, the 75th anniversary of the signing of Executive Order 9066. The Block Museum, in partnership with the JACL, JASC, Multicultural Student Affairs, Chicago Japanese American Historical Society, Japanese Mutual Aid Society, and the Chicago Japanese American Council, hosted an event within my installation, which featured elders who had experienced the incarceration. Over 200 people participated. This was part of a Chicago-wide day of remembrance. Here is a short video made by the Block Museum.
Now I will read a letter written by Kristine Aono, as she could not be here. Dear participants of this Day of Remembrance, I wish I could be joining you at the Block Museum for this important day of remembrance. As a sansei, a third-generation Japanese American, I treasure those personal stories of triumph and struggle that are chapters in the collective narrative of our country. As an artist, I have long been interested in my family history and the effect that the internment camp experience has had on who we are today. Those 3.5 years spent incarcerated had a profound and lasting effect on the Issei, Nisei, and subsequent generations. Years ago, I came across the Japanese proverb, deru kugi wa utareru, which translates as, the nail that sticks up the farthest takes the most pounding. This describes the Japanese belief that one should act as a group, not cause trouble, and not call attention to oneself. To me, this phrase explains why the Issei and Nisei decided to obey the government's orders and, in the vast majority of cases, enter the camps without protest. They were told they could prove their loyalty to the US by their obedience. As a sansei and a civil rights era American, this concept is opposite of the more Western phrase, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. From the Japanese proverb, I created this installation, The Nail That Sticks Up the Farthest, which also incorporates copies of documents from the National Archives of Testimony given by former internees during the hearings of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians in the early 1980s. Over the surface of this piece is a stippled grid of 120,313 holes, a hole for each person interned in the camps. I invite you to do more than passively view this artwork. Come in closer, read the testimony from former internees and the letters from my grandfather, ponder the past and connect to the present. Finally, I hope that your experience of adding nails to the wall will be a reminder that we all have an obligation to take action for the persecuted who have no power. I hope we can prevent history from repeating itself and that we will find strength to be the nail that sticks up the farthest for victims of oppression.
Well, thank you, Kristine. That was really wonderful. I have to admit that I'm become a massive fanboy of yours, of your work. I love installation because I love the interaction, that interactive quality between the visitor and the artist.
Mhm.
And I was wondering, because you showed on the nail piece how the unexpected words, the things that weren't planned as far as your piece. And you talked about that, they were asking how you felt about it, but did you ever anticipate that somebody was going to go rogue and bring their work into your work?
No, I mean, the first time that I exhibited this piece, I don't know why I was thinking that people would just, put them in the holes that were already there. And when you think about it, people who go to a museum, a lot of times they're creative types, and creative types usually don't follow the rules, right? So that's kind of what I really loved about the unexpected happening. I will say, though, that when it was shown the second time with the big wall that was 50 feet long, the bags were far on the ends. And one thing we discovered was, because it was spread out so far, is that people were taking nails out of the wall and reinserting them instead of walking over and getting the nails. So when we discovered that, we had to put a sign up that said, please don't remove walls that are already inserted. Please do not remove nails that are already inserted in the wall. Because one thing that I knew was that people would come up to me afterwards and say, I picked a very special place. They would be reading the text, and that's how they chose where they wanted to put their nails. So it was very deliberate where people chose to put nails. And I didn't like the idea that someone might take those nails out and put them in someplace else. So that was one thing that we changed, was asking them not to remove nails. We also, there was a concern that what would happen if someone were to spell something out that was offensive or something? What do we do then? And my feeling was, well, if someone does that, then other people can come and obliterate it by adding more nails. So luckily we didn't seem to have anything that was offensive. But yeah, I had to leave it open for people to be creative.
Well, I'm glad you had classy visitors. So also I was noticing that on the piece, when you had the close-up of the nail piece with the holes, and it's almost like I was looking at the pieces, and I thought, if everybody filled those nail holes in solid, you would almost obliterate some of the text of the underlying documents. Was that something that you thought about, that transformation of the text?
That yes, I mean, you could actually still read some of it, but it was harder. It definitely was harder to read. In some ways, it's almost that transformation of just filling it in completely would almost feel like that was a step forward. You know, it's a way of getting enough people involved to also honor every single person who was in those camps. So all 120,313, which would be really kind of, that's an enormous number, right? And actually putting those nails in takes a long time. So it took an army of people to put the nails in that we did have in for the start of the show, and that was approximately 60,000. But yeah, which is a lot. But yeah, it's that would be quite an accomplishment to get all of them in the wall.
Were you afraid that people wouldn't participate when you first started doing this? That, because it's a museum and a lot of things, you don't touch the art, and you don't, am I allowed to do this? Did you have specific instructions when they went in, or how did you to prompt them to do it?
There was small text on the wall as you entered that asked people to add nails to the wall in honor and memory of those who'd been interned. And what was helpful also is that there was an opening. So there was an opening reception, and people were adding nails during that time. So then people could see when they came in that there were things added. You could tell that nails had been added. So I think that helped, that people kind of could see what they could do.
Yeah. So where's the nail piece now? What's going on?
So as is the nature of installation art, it no longer exists, which is fine with me. Some people find that hard to grasp, that you create art that is only temporary. But these pieces, and I consider the piece that was in Long Beach and the piece that was at the Block Museum to be completely different pieces. One of the reasons is because they are site specific. They were made specifically for the space that I was given, and also because they were different times and different communities that were involved, which made them so very, very different. The nature of installation art is that it is only up. It is site specific, and it usually is only up for a certain amount of time. And for me, these are pieces that symbolize a certain time in history. So it's fine that they are dismantled. And thank goodness for photography, right?
Yeah.
That we can record them. So they don't exist anymore.
And the other thing is, for those who don't do installations, the other option is to rent storage units everywhere and store everything. That was my world as an installation artist for a long time. How have you ever thought, because of the current situation now, would you like to, or you thought about making a new version of it? Because the great thing I loved about both versions, that people brought their world into your artwork. It wasn't the expected. It wasn't about what you're talking. It's the things that they're suffering. And now, the stuff that I saw on those pieces are the stuff that I would see now in the protests across the country right now.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And when the piece was in Long Beach and the LA riots broke out after the acquittal of the police in the Rodney King verdict, that made it very, very site specific, very much about the people living in that neighborhood, people experiencing what was going on. And what's going on right now is really important. So I think, yes, it would be very interesting to be able to do this piece again in a specific city and have the reaction of that community in that piece.
Yeah. It's interesting because the fact that you're talking about you're installing that piece during the riots, and at Janum, that they were getting ready. Opening day was supposed to be the day after the riots started, and so like my mom was volunteering and my aunt was volunteering. They were working at the museum. When my mom was there, they had no idea what was going on outside the doors. And so for that connection, that tie, I thought, into the community, between the Black community and, or not the communities themselves, but the situations going on, that, they were finally being able to have a voice in many ways to protest what's happening to them, at the same time that this museum is finally opening to tell the stories of the Japanese American experience. I thought it was just a really powerful time. So you talked about, or we talked about the fact that you installation art. So why installation? Why do you do it?
So I started out in sculpture. I actually started out when I was going to college. I thought I would do sculpture and graphic design, and those are about as opposite as you can get. I do sculpture, and I've studied all different ways of making sculpture. I like to describe it as having a lot of tools in my toolkit. So the way I approach sculpture or art is to think that to not have myself be confined to certain materials. I like to think that whatever my idea is, I can realize it in whatever materials I want. So that's one of the reasons why installation art appeals to me, because there are no walls necessarily closing me in. I can choose what the walls are. I can choose the space. It's not just an object in the middle of a room. I can invite the viewer to become an active participant by walking into a space or actively doing something in that space. So it's not just looking at something on a wall or looking at something plopped in the middle of a room. It's actually becoming active in the entire space. So it just allows me to have more control over everything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I love, the idea that you think about the installation and the participation by the visitor. It's almost like I did an installation once on a virtual tea ceremony. And so as the artist, I was the host and my visitors were the guests. But the guests in a tea ceremony are just as active a participant as the host is. And right. So for that idea that they actually take ownership and they can share that an experience with installations is really, really interesting. So do you only do installations?
No, I do sculpture too. And it's based on whatever my idea is. So if if sculpture is the way that would convey the idea better, then I will do sculpture. Let's see, an example is I did a whole series of kimono sculptures. Let's see, Royce, would you mind pulling up rope kimono, please? So in this series, I've probably done 20 different kimonos, versions of kimonos. Not all of them are standalone pieces like this. Some of them are wall pieces. But the rope kimonos came about from my experiences wearing a kimono, and also I have such a respect for the art of kimono making, and it has all kinds of rules and protocol about how you wear it, and the way it depicts the person who's wearing it. It also will really kind of make you move and walk and sit a certain way. So this piece actually is specifically about being a female, and it's about stereotypes and literal cultural constraints. And all of these kimono pieces are, they're actually, they have an exterior and an interior. And the interior space is usually filled with something that's ephemeral. And in this case, this one is filled with leaves from a Japanese maple tree and a Eastern maple tree, regular, the kind of maple tree you would find in the US. So so it's a mix. And then let's see, how about if we see flag kimono next? So flag kimono is also in the same series. The kimonos that I made that, like rope kimono, I should say, is made out of a wire mesh that's folded into the shape, and then it's covered with fabric that's dipped in a hydrocal plaster. And so what I ended up doing was I started sewing kimonos just out of the wire mesh that the more sculptural pieces were made out of. So this piece is made out of that wire mesh and painted to look like the American flag. And all of these are sewn, hand sewn together. The wire mesh is sewn, and it's very lightweight. It's made out of an aluminum mesh, and then it hangs from this aluminum bar. But I did like I said, I did many of these different versions of types of kimono. I did a kimono that was based on my grandma, another one based on ancestors. And if you could bring up the one titled Cultural Inheritance, please. And then I did these more truncated versions of kimonos, and this is a female shape. And this one I call Cultural Inheritance, and it shows 3 generations. So the Issei is on the top, Nisei is in the middle, and Sansei, my generation, is the bottom one. And what I do is, this is also that same mesh that's been sewn together, and I poured a mixture of broken up pieces of dried Japanese maple leaf and some gold leaf flake and some black charcoal through the top one, and it sifts down through the second and then through the third, and that's supposed to represent culture and how culture slowly gets lost through the generations. When I was working on this piece, I actually discovered that I was pregnant with my first child. And so originally I was going to just have this mixture fall onto the floor because it sort of makes a pattern going out. And then I realized it was sort of precious. So I made this basin on the bottom that catches it. And then since then, I've displayed this piece with a 4th generation. So I show the Yonsei generation. So this is one of the kimonos that I've done. And there are, like I said, probably 20 in the series. It's an ongoing series.
Okay. So when you work on these pieces, do you like find a material that you think, oh, this would be kind of great to do? Like, I imagine this mesh, it has this very, in a sense, a very, even though it's hard, a very clothified quality, because you can mold it and you can have it take on the characteristics of fabric without it being soft and formless. But do you do that, or do you like the nail pieces? Was it the saying that that you saw and you thought, oh, that kind of inspires me visually to do something? How do you do this your process of art?
My process of art takes a long time. Like the nail piece was inspired when I found that saying. But putting all the pieces together, like knowing that I wanted to have the CWRIC testimony as part of it, and my grandfather's letters, it was sort of, I was just reading all kinds of things in it, and it all sort of came together. Finding that phrase was sort of inspiration for me. With the kimono, it's actually based on a very bizarre story, but I was waitressing. After I graduated from college, I thought I was going to do this starving artist thing. I'd waitress and I'd do my art. And I got a job when I first moved to the DC area, working at it's a teppanyaki style Japanese restaurant, kind of Benihana style. The kind of place that most Japanese don't go to, but people go to it for the show. It's where they throw the food around with the knives and all that. And when I got there to apply for the job, the first thing the woman said to me was, "You speak really good English. Can you come in tomorrow, bring your kimono?" And I said, I have a kimono, but it's from when I was 5 years old. And she said, "It's okay. We'll have stuff for you, but you'll have to buy it eventually." So when I showed up the next day, I went into the dressing room and there were about 20 other Asian women getting dressed in kimono, and all these different languages, all these different Asian languages were being said, and nobody was speaking Japanese. So I was dressed in kimono, wearing, the geta sandals that are really high. And I was an experienced waitress. So I was used to moving fast, especially the lunch crowd and all that. And I couldn't move my feet more than, I had to shuffle. When I handed people their food, I had to hold my sleeve back in order to hand them the food. And then I had to, everything was dictated by the kimono that I was wearing. And that's what inspired this piece, was that experience of realizing that I couldn't move in the world that I know wearing this kimono. But I like I said, I truly am very, I adore the whole history of kimono. And I think I really respect that as an art form, but personally wearing one was not me. So that's where the kimono series started, was because of that experience. And finding the material for doing it, I was thinking I would use chicken wire and plaster, and I've always hated using chicken wire. You use that and you cut your hands up. So one of the things that I love to do is I love hardware stores. I just will walk the aisles and just see all kinds of different ideas of what I can use as materials. And I discovered this aluminum mesh that is called gutter guard. It's only, a few inches wide, and you stick it in your gutters to keep the leaves out. And I realized this is really wonderful stuff. It's already got sort of a beautiful grid. It's lightweight. I can sew it together and it bends really nicely. So that's how I started making those pieces. It's just kind of a trial and error. And also just sort of having a background in lots of different materials just gives you more ideas.
Yeah. Okay. I'm actually going to go to we have some questions here, and there's one that I would normally ask at the very end, but since we kind of passed on talking about that, and you mentioned about the nail piece. So Aaron Shigaki asks, Kristine, do you plan to install the nail piece again? Also, what new concept are you working on, if you don't mind sharing?
Great questions.
For new pieces, what are you doing?
Yeah. So I would love to install the nail piece again. It really needs the support of an institution like the Long Beach Museum of Art or the Marion Lee Block Museum. They were wonderful to work with, and it really takes a lot of people to put that together. So lots of careful planning, but yeah, I would love to. I would love to. At the moment, there are not plans to do it again. And so the newer pieces that I'm working on. So I recently finished a piece that's called Tadaima of Resilience. And Royce, would you mind pulling up the before image of that piece? It's thank you. So this piece is actually on display in a virtual show right now called Shift at the McLean Project for the Arts in Virginia. This piece it's a familiar little figure. I mean, some of you might recognize this little Tadaima. Tadaima is based on a Japanese it's based on a Japanese story of a monk who was so dedicated, and he meditated for so long that he lost the use of his arms and legs. That's how the story goes. And so he became this symbol of resilience and perseverance, because you could knock him down and he would always upright himself. So these little figures are popular in Japanese culture because they're usually made out of sort of a paper mache kind of material, and they're usually only about maybe 7 inches tall or something. And the custom is that they come with no eyes painted in, and you paint in one eye and you make a wish, or you set a goal. And at the end of 1 year, you're supposed to have reached that goal, and you can paint in the other eye. So Tadaima is sort of this symbol of hope, and so what I decided to do was I wanted to use the figure of Tadaima as a symbol of hope for the hurt that a lot of us are feeling right now, because there's so many things that are happening that are based on racism or oppression, things we're seeing our government do. So I made this Tadaima. He's really big. He's 5 feet tall, and when he's displayed, he's supposed to go on a 2-foot high pedestal. So he would actually be 7 feet up, and or 7 feet high. So this piece is about righting wrongs. There are documents that are adhered to the outside of this piece, and these are copies of government documents that depict shameful times in our history when racism and exclusion and oppression and greed caused our government to make very unjust decisions. So these documents are things like Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, the Indian Removal Act of 1830, the Dred Scott decision of 1856, Executive Order 9066, 1942, and Executive Order 13769, which is the Muslim travel ban of 2017. So this is a piece about unfortunate times in our history, shameful times in our history, but like I said, I wanted it to be a hopeful piece. So the part that is hopeful is I want people to add to this piece by adding these sort of sticky notes. So if you could put up the let's see, it is the detail shot, Tadaima detail. These are what it would look like after it's been displayed, after people add these sticky notes that have a drawing of a Tadaima on it. And what I'm hoping is that people would fill in one eye, make their wish, and write down what their wish for change would be. So these are some examples like Black Lives Matter, end voter suppression, the Equal Rights Amendment, Believe Women, LGBTQIA rights, all these issues that are happening right now that I'm hoping we can cause change to happen. So that's what this piece is about. And it's actually going to be in a traveling show that's called Resilience, a Sansei Sense of Legacy. This will travel hopefully starting in 2021. The curators are Jerry Takagawa and Gail Enns, and it's being traveled by the Mid-Atlantic Arts Alliance. There are other artists in this show who are also participating in Tadaima. The artists in Resilience are Roger Shimomura, Tom Nakashima, Lydia Nakashima-Dagarod, Naomi Judy Shintani, Reiko Fuji, Jerry Takagawa, and Wendy Maruyama. So that's something that's in the future. And there's also a slide of this piece, how it would look afterwards. So that's the after. Yeah.
But his eye's not filled in yet.
No, not yet, but hopefully, right?
Yeah. So is there a symbolism for the whether this piece being 5 feet or the overall height being 7 feet, or you just wanted this bigger than life thing to attract more attention to the visitor?
Well, because it's traveling, I had to keep in mind that some places might not have a ceiling that's higher than 8 feet. So, and I wanted it to be as big as I could possibly make it. So that's one of the reasons. Yeah.
Okay. So we have a question from Clement Hanami. He writes, Relocations and Revisions was one of the first major exhibitions based on the incarceration using Japanese American artists in a non-Asian institution. How did it feel to be part of this groundbreaking exhibition? You might want to talk about what that exhibition actually was.
So that's the one of the nail pieces. That was that exhibit was really great. It involved many installations. Paintings by Roger Shimomura was in that, and Tom Nakashima, and that was it was really an exciting exhibit to be part of. That was the one where we were installing during the riots, and I remember us all thinking, oh, what should we do? You know, what should we be doing? And we all agreed that what we were doing was important, that the message of what our art was about how people needed to remember how the camps were something that our government did in a time of upheaval, and it was a wrong decision made, and based on racism. And so for us, we felt like the message was really important, that the message was that racism still exists and we still have work to do.
So, I mean, because there weren't shows like this in, a non-Asian targeted audience. Did you have, I mean, was there a lot of apprehension over to how you would be received, or the artwork, or the message would be received?
I wasn't worried about how it was going to be received, but I do recall that Noriko Gamblin had told me that she was having a hard time getting people to accept this show that was all about a Japanese American history, right? And she said that there was one instance talking to, I don't know if it was like a neighborhood committee or something, where somebody was very skeptical. And later that person came to the museum and was really, really taken by everything that was there, and felt it was very relevant. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it was maybe because of the racially charged time we were in at that time, mm-hmm. And being able to see that it was relevant. I'm not sure, but I remember that she had personally felt that there could be some tension because it was about a certain group of people.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, before we go on any further, I'm going to apologize, but I don't care. We're going to go over. This is so great. So, there's a couple questions here that are interestingly from men, and it goes back to the kimono exhibit. So, Ken Mochizuki, did it occur to you doing your kimono exhibit that the kimono was invented by men to constrict women physically and symbolically?
Oh, absolutely, because the kimono actually, it goes back to Japanese theater, and kabuki, where men were all the actors and men had to look like women. And so, and fashion followed theater. So women's kimonos were based on men wearing them. That's one of the reasons why it just kind of makes you straight. Because it just wraps you really tightly, and the obi just sort of negates your waist. So yeah, very much it was designed by men, actually for men. Yeah, very, very good question. Thank you.
And I love the fact that you talked about that. It comes from theater, and that when you wore the kimono at the restaurant, that was theater.
Yeah.
It was, and you had to do your little knee walking.
Right.
And it's interesting how, it's all for that show, mm-hmm. and the impracticality of it. Okay. And the second question from Thomas Kurihara. Kristine, do you have opinion about the constraints on the role of women in Japan wearing kimono and the cultural development of their mannerisms affected by the kimono?
Well, fortunately, most women in Japan aren't wearing kimono on the day-to-day basis. It's when I was working at the restaurant, the other women told me, when we take a break, make sure you change out of your kimono because you can't eat when you're wearing it. It's so tight. There are no buttons. It's on you. It stays on you because it's wrapped so tightly. And so it's just completely impractical in those ways. And when women sit in a car, they have to enter the car a certain way, and they have to sit down a certain way because they can't lean back against the obi. It's it's beautiful. It really is beautiful. I think it's a gorgeous art form, completely impractical to comfortably wear. Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of the story I heard about Rihanna wore a dress to some awards, and it was this big mess, and she had to just kind of squeeze herself into the car and fit in, and totally impractical way. She couldn't sit back because of this dress, the way it fit on her. She loved the way it looked, but horribly impractical for a garment.
Sure.
So let's get to our connection, in a sense, the camps, and the visitation of them. What was it like? Okay, first off, I have two questions that kind of relate to this. At what point did you decide you had to visit all 10? Was it in creating a piece, or just because you thought you had to visit all 10? And then what was like when you first visited, when you first step foot on the sites?
Well, the first camp that I went to see was actually Topaz in Utah, and that was in 1988. Because my friend Dwayne Jeffrey, who I mentioned earlier, grew up in the town of Delta. And then when I did the installation at Long Beach in 92, one of the weekends that I was there installing was a pilgrimage to Manzanar. So I went to the pilgrimage. And then the other camps I went to were in 94 and 95. I did all the other ones in 94 and 95 and went back to both Topaz and Manzanar again. And I think by that time, I had already decided to do relics from camp. I probably had already been talking with Karen Higa and Angela Adams, the two curators. And so I think that's when I decided I needed to go to all of them and also collect the soil. When I went to Jerome and Rower and Minidoka, I went with my parents. So that was really special to get to go there with them, because it was the first time they'd been back since the war.
Wow. So what kind of impressions did you have time to kind of be alone at the camp when you first approached them, or that you could at least, what were your thoughts about, how did you feel when you first stepped foot in those sites?
They were all so different, it was really interesting to see how different all of them were. And going there, I mean, you must have had this experience too. Your mind is trying to figure out what am I seeing that was there back in the 40s, and what am I seeing is newer. So trying to figure out that part of it was really important, because I'm also aiming my camera, right, and trying to figure out, is this the right shot, or am I showing it true? Also, I went with different people. All these different visits, I went with different people. So that sort of changed the dynamic. Going with my parents was really special, and I was very focused on them. And then during this time, I had my daughter. So having a baby along also changes the dynamic. But they were all very different. What were your impressions when you first?
Well, I was in a sense, I went solo on everything, and so when I met people, it was locals. So, for instance, when I was at Topaz, I met Jane, and then Jane introduced me pretty much everybody. But that was my introduction. When I was at where was it? Oh no, also at Topaz, I met this couple who they were marble collectors. And so they would go to Topaz to collect marbles, and that there's just a lot of artifacts in the ground, and so they would collect them. and so every month or so, and they would camp. And so they before glamping was a term, they glamped. They had this Chevy Suburban that was just the bed in the back, and then they pulled this former U-Haul trailer, and she had the most amazing deluxe kitchen there. And so one of the great things about was being able to meet people, and for me to be able to teach them a little bit about, because they really didn't know what the sites were about. And then in their case, they didn't believe in camping rough. And so they invited me for dinner. We had wine, filet mignon. I mean, it was just an amazing experience. And for each of those camps, it was like that. But I thought, and it kind of goes into the part I really loved about Relics from Camp was that it was almost the dirt. That was almost the thing that I think really drove the uniqueness of the camps. I mean, Topaz. Did you ever go in bad weather, not hot, but bad weather at Topaz, like rain at all?
No, but we have kind of a connection to Utah, so I go to Utah a lot, and the desert in the rain is really something, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, yeah, because it's an alkaline mud. And so if anybody else, obviously people at Topaz knew about this, but if you notice, there were a lot of geta at Topaz. And one of the reasons why is this mud was so sticky that one spring I went there. I tried to go different seasons if I could. So if it was a camp known to be extremely cold, I'd try to go in winter. And with Topaz, because there is no good season for Topaz, I went 4 times each of the different seasons. And I remember walking around in the camp, and after a few minutes of walking, I had like 6 inches of mud on the bottom of my shoes, just stuck to the bottom of my shoe. And that's when I saw like boot scrapers, and I saw all the things that people did to try to get rid of the problem. And other camps like Amachi were sand. It was a very, very sandy one. Some camps didn't really have that personality. Like Heart Mountain was mostly farmed, and so there really wasn't that presence of soil or that personality showing through. But to me, that was, and I had like blueprints of the camp. So for me to be able to identify some of the original structures was a little bit easier. But at the same time, I wasn't sure, was it something rebuilt on the site of the old building, or was it an old building? It was never, in the beginning, was never quite sure. It took me about a year of traveling and then researching afterwards to figure out, trying to find photographs of the camp and seeing, is that building an original building, or is that one that's been replaced with something new?
So you had, I think you went about it smarter than I did, because you had all those maps. I would love to go back. I definitely need to go back to a lot of these camps and see what they look like now, especially the National Park Service has done so much. It'd be very interesting. Now, you started talking about the soil, and I wanted to comment on that, because that is something that I was just amazed at how different all the soil is. And the different soils really reflect how different the experiences were. Like, for instance, my mom was in Arkansas, and Arkansas is rainy and humid and muggy, very different from where she grew up in California. So when I went with my parents to see Jerome and Rower, I remember we were driving out there, and there's a house that's fairly close to where the monument is. And I actually knocked on the door just to see if anybody was home. My dad was very nervous about, just bothering people. But I thought, I've gone all the way out here. I'm not, it will be a long time before I get back. I'd like to talk to somebody. But so nobody was there. We drove out towards a water tower out in a field, and we could see there was a pickup truck coming towards us. And my dad was sort of nervous, like, oh, are we trespassing? I said, oh, don't worry, just roll down the window. And the truck pulled up next to us, and this very tall man leans out his window and said, "Are you coming home?" And when he said that, we all, it's like, okay, everything's good. And that man was John Ellington, who you also met, right? And he was just wonderful. He spent the day with us and took us to lunch at a diner, which we've talked about. You probably were treated to the same diner.
His favorite diner.
Yeah. It was really, just kind of one of these places I never would have found. It was great. And then later we were at his farm, and I asked him if it would be okay if I got some of the soil from his farm. And he said, well, what kind do you want? And I said, are there different kinds? And he said, oh yeah, there's the loamy stuff over there. And then there's the stuff we call gumbo. It's the stuff that pulls the boots off your feet. And my mom said, oh, I remember the gumbo. And I said, well, I think we need to have both. So he helped dig up this gumbo. And then what happened was for relics from camp, for the installation, to sterilize the soil is all put in an oven and baked, and that will kill all the live parts of the soil. So I wasn't even thinking about this gumbo, and I stuck it in the oven. And it came out like rocks, right? Because it was basically, it's clay. So I remember bringing it to Janum. These buckets got shipped out to Janum. And Clement Hinami and Babaragami they spent hours trying to break it down with sledgehammers out in the parking lot. And we managed to get it small enough that we could spread it out enough. But everybody knew that this was happening. And then we had the collection day. And the collection days were really wonderful. They were the time when community members would come in and they'd bring their artifacts that they'd saved from camp days. And almost always they would say, oh, this probably is not very important, and then it'd be some wonderful thing that they were bringing in. So on one of the collection days, a man came in and he brought in, actually, if you could show the slide of Relics Jerome, that would be good. Yeah, okay. So this is showing the Jerome box. During the collection day, a man named Richard Murakami came in with the little clay figure that you see in the middle. And he said that was a figure that his aunt made of his brother when they were in the camps. Wow. And yeah, it's made out of that soil. It's made out of that clay. So it's really
I want to point
special.
out, for visitors to the museum now, we've changed out the objects because best practice in museum is you don't leave them on exhibit for a long time, that you need to rotate them through. So there's a whole different set of artifacts in these pieces now.
Right. And I also want to point out that none of these artifacts are actually on the soil. They're on a plexiglass stand, so they don't actually touch the soil. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was talking to Clement about this too, and he said, "Yeah, we actually were really worried. Could we even bring dirt into the museum because of all the the critters that might be living in it?" And I think he said actually that they had to heat it like 3 times, I think, or something like that.
Right.
To make sure they killed everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I had experienced was like the marble hunters and other people, basically every other camp, is I met all these locals, and they had a bunch of, they gave me so many artifacts, and some of them, I mean, I got 4 windows from Tule Lake, barrack windows.
Wow.
I got this cement mushroom from Topaz that was from a garden. And these are all things that they collect. And the problem was they collected them. So there's not really, I don't have a direct provenance of where they came from. So they get a little problematic from that point of view. But were there any artifacts? And so because of this, there's just amazing. My imagination goes crazy with the stories that I attach to these artifacts. Were there any artifacts or people that you met there that really stood out to you? Like you mentioned John, for instance. I mean, and it's funny. If you went to lunch with John, you may not have seen this in action. But I went to dinner with him to that little restaurant, and the man does not get bitten by mosquitoes. I was eaten alive when we're standing outside afterwards talking, and never saw one even land on him. But so, are there any objects or people that really stood out to you?
Well, Jane Beckwith is somebody who really stands out. I mean, that she is the driving force behind the Topaz Museum, and she was always very, very generous with her time, and that she was really great to get to meet. I saw her on a couple of occasions, and usually when we went, we didn't go during a pilgrimage, and we didn't see many people. So seeing John Ellington was special. We ran into some families at Minidoka who we spoke to, who were farmers on the land there, and that was really nice to talk to people who have been farming the land since the war. It's interesting because a lot of these places were deemed uninhabitable. A lot of the places were reservation land or something like that, and in many cases, the Japanese American farmers, so many of the West Coast farmers were put in these camps and managed to farm the land. A lot of it is farmland now.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting also that most of the camps, part of the reason for the camps was to bring water to develop farming. And like Jerome and Rohrer were the opposite. They had to drain the swamp land to create the camp. So that was make that arable land. They actually had to get rid of the water out of the camps.
Right.
So a question here from Susan Morita. Did you grow up knowing about the J incarceration experience, or was there a moment that you recall when you learned about that history?
Hi, Susan. I do remember growing up, and my parents didn't talk about the camps. And I think that was a very common thing, that the Nikkei really didn't talk openly about the camps, but they would refer to the camps. So they would say, "Oh, we did that in camp." And I remember thinking, "Wow, my parents went to camp, and we never get to go to summer camp." And so I think it was I was probably maybe around 12 or something when I finally found out what the camps were, and that was a time when it really wasn't taught much in high school, or in school at all. It just wasn't taught that much. And when I remember taking U.S. history, and my sister and I, we were living in Chicago suburbs. We were the only, I think there may have been only 4 Japanese in this huge high school, and I have a twin sister, so we're in the same class, and the teacher starts reading the one sentence that's in our U.S. history book about, the camps, and they call them the internment camps. And he turns to us and says, "Do you know anything about that?" And we were both sort of horrified, and we were both at the time extremely shy. So we said yes, but didn't go into it. But that was all that was in U.S. history. That was all that it was one sentence. Hopefully, from what I understand, these days things have changed. But
well, I've heard that it just regionally depends. Some places still don't, and some places do more. So were you horrified because now all eyes in the classroom upon you, and you're stood out as being different? Okay.
Yeah, that's what it was. I mean, we were very young. I think obviously now I'm not at all shy about telling the story.
So how old were your folks during the war?
How old were they?
Yeah.
So my dad was, I want to get this straight. My dad was 12 when he went in, and my mom was 9.
Okay.
So they were little. For my mom, she remembers crying. She says she remembers crying the first night and keeping everybody in the barracks awake because she was crying. And my dad's experience was, he was a teenager, and he just got to run loose with his friends, right? All over the camp. And what was interesting was when I went with my dad to Minidoka, it was the first time he'd been back. And my dad has a really, really amazing memory, especially spatially. And he could remember where his barracks were. So there's actually a picture of him digging the dirt where his barrack was. Royce, would you mind pulling up Relics Tamaono?
So what barrack, do you remember the block he was in?
He would remember. I don't remember, but he would remember.
Okay.
Yeah. So he's digging dirt where his barrack was.
Wait a minute. He's digging dirt and taking National Park Service land?
At that time, it wasn't National Park Service. I think we met the family I think that's their farmland.
Okay. We have to have sick Hanako on him.
Yeah. Yeah. No, well, that dirt would be at Janum right now, anyway.
Yeah. So did you ask him, or did he want to do this? Do you remember?
I probably asked him.
Okay.
But he's very interested in things like this. In fact, I'd love to take him to the Minidoka pilgrimage.
We've talked about this, by the way. So Mia, Hanako, and all the other Tadaima Minidoka people, we're going next year. Okay.
Okay. Meet you there. I'll meet you there. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, this is, I think it's just really, it's really fun to see when people do go back for the first time to the sites, and just, all the different emotions that come back to them. And, sometimes it's just, heartbreaking because they don't do well. It's just, they can't, all of a sudden, all the hurt and pain that they kind of wanted to bury and hide or forget about come back. And other times, it just, helps them heal, I think, sometimes. So, yeah. So it's not really a question, but Kimiko in the background is asking us, hey, what about Jerome Rohr? Meaning she runs the pilgrimages for those camps. So.
Sure. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
So how old were you when you really learned about your family's history in the camps?
I don't remember an exact moment. I think what happened was we all just started asking questions. And I think that what I've learned is one of the great things about doing the Relics from Camp, the community days, is that when there's an object or something like that, it can start people talking. Because I know with my parents, they aren't very talkative people, but I learned that I needed to know the questions to ask them. But if I didn't know what the questions were, that was the problem. So finding out more about the camps was really important so that I could know what questions to ask them. But also things like, artifacts that we had in the house, like the nameplate that was outside the barracks of my dad's barrack, that could spark conversation. So that was one of the reasons why I thought Relics from Camp was important, just to get different generations to start talking, because almost always, like I had said, people would say, oh, you probably don't need this, it's not very important. But they're all those things are so important, and I'm hoping that the Nikkei understand that their children and grandchildren really want to know these stories. They really want to know the history.
Mm-hmm. So when like the nameplate,
Mm-hmm.
so that was that in your grandparents' home, or was that something your dad had? Or okay, so was it up and visible, or was it something just like put away in a suitcase and hidden away, and all of a sudden one day you discovered it, or how did that work?
So my dad's family lived in Portland, and they had a neighbor watching the house when they were in the camps. And when they returned, they were able to live in that house again. And the story is that, and my cousin is living there now. The story is that in the garage, they had the nameplate hanging up in the garage,
Mm-hmm.
and it was there for a long time, alongside a jar that had a rattlesnake in it that was also from the camps or something like that. I don't know what happened to the rattlesnake, but the nameplate is now in the collection at Janum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My dad's father used to catch rattlesnakes at Amachi, and he was only there for about a year because he was in the Department of Justice camps most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But he used to catch rattlesnakes, and there was a guy there that was the rattlesnake man that actually used to do it. And actually, I guess sell them to hospitals for the antivenom or something.
Really?
But so after my grandfather had passed away, I got his rattlesnake parts. So there were skins, fangs, rattles. My mom made me throw it away. but I had a jar of parts too. So did you ever see this nameplate in the garage? You remember seeing that at all, or is it just something that happened after the fact?
I didn't see it that I remember, because I was a lot younger at that time, and we would make trips out to Portland to see my grandparents, but I was quite young, and I'm not sure. I think that the nameplate hung there for a long time, because when we donated it to Janum, and my older sister brought it in, I think it was like around 96 or something like that we brought it in. So yeah.
So yeah, it's really interesting because I'm actually totally going to make protocol for art things here. There's a project that I'm working on. It actually kind of leads to the thing you were talking about, is that I have found that a lot of people grew up in homes where they didn't know much about the camps, but there might be a painting or like a wood piece on the wall, and so they ask their grandmother, great grandmother, whatever, like, what is that? And they might say, oh yeah, Papa did this in camp. And so it's the thing, oh, it's like the summer craft, summer camp, and they do crafting and stuff like that. And I think that with a lot of we've done with the camps have been really, originally was talking with the Issei or having them tell their story, and then now the Nisei, because we're losing so many of them. Those of us who weren't or too young to be in the camp, we're the descendants of the camp survivors, is we don't have many stories to tell, and people haven't heard the stories. But in fact, we have those stories. We are now the caretakers of our parents and grandparents' stories. And a lot of times, I came from a family where my dad wouldn't stop talking about camp growing up. I've never known a time in my life where I didn't know about camp.
Wow.
And so we're weird in that way. Whereas most people are like you. It was just something that wasn't talked about. I wasn't ever allowed to ask my grandparents about camp, but I did know that, I knew their story, what they went through. And so this idea that all these people, and so I can't imagine what it's like. And so I've just been fascinated by the fact that all these people would grow up and see these artifacts, these objects in the house, and they know it's from camp. They don't know what camp is, and they don't know that the family story behind being in camp. And then one day, somehow, or over a period of time, they start learning the full truth behind that object. And so
Right.
I was thinking, oh, imagine talking to these descendants and having this object to tell the story, and then I photograph them with the object in a place of significance. Like if there was a suitcase, to actually photograph them at the point of departure to go to the camps. Or to take that name, I can't take it in Janum now, but to take a nameplate and actually go back to the barracks site and photograph them with that site to bring back their ancestors, their grandparents and parents, and to bring them now they become part of that story, a very tight member and part element of that story. I think it's fascinating.
Is that your next project?
That's a project I've started working on. I kind of put on hold because I moved from Colorado to here, and so I stopped doing that. But yeah, it's definitely something that I'm developing now that I have more time and more stable life. I have a job, so I could start figuring, okay, how am I going to approach this again? But yeah, I think we, the Sanseis, or at least the children and the grandchildren, the people in the camps, really, now it's our turn to start owning some of these stories and
agree.
Contributing. Yeah.
It also, just knowing that is the experience that our parents had, sort of, for me at least, it really explains the way my parents chose to raise me, right? Like a lot of Sansei, I don't know how to speak Japanese. So my parents didn't teach us Japanese, even though at one point we lived sort of in a multi-generational situation in Chicago where my grandparents lived in the brownstone we were in. So when I was very young, Japanese was spoken because my grandparents were there. But I think it's very typical that the Sansei weren't taught Japanese. And part of that is because our parents were very young children when they were put in these camps, and just knew somehow that it was important that they raise children who were very American, and that there would be no question of their nationality, right? So, but understanding what the trauma basically that they were raised in explains our upbringing.
Yeah. I unfortunately went to Japanese school for 6 years. It was living hell. And it was like, because we lived in a very, very Caucasian area, the West San Fernando Valley in LA. And so to kind of get in touch more, I think, with our Japanese ancestry, that they sent us to Japanese school. But my family was one of two families that they didn't speak Japanese as the primary language in the house. So everybody went to the Japanese school. They already spoke Japanese all over the place. And my parents spoke Japanese to keep secrets from the kids. So it was not good. But but I, and I agree with it. I think that a big part of how Sansei were brought up, and it had to be the Sansei had to just a lot of times discover the Japanese in them rather than the parents doing it to a lot of times. Yeah. We are horribly late.
Yeah, we are.
So I think we have to quit this. I have had a great time. I mean, like I said, by the way, we talked for 3 hours just on a phone call when we first met. So it's amazing. I really thank you very much.
Thank you. Really,
for doing this with us, and it's great meeting you. And we'll definitely see you at least at Minidoka, maybe Drummer sometime. And so next week we have two artists, Reiko Fuji and Ellen Bepp, who are two Bay Area artists who will be talking next week. So please join us for that. And so thank you, Kristine. And
thank you.
We'll see you in the future. Okay, bye.